a Sapphire Running Zone podcast.
Hi everyone, Tim from the Sapphire Running Zone. Welcome to episode 2 in our Setting Goals podcast as part of our training and fundraising support podcast series. So we are with Andrew Ogierman again, and Andrew has completed 100 half marathons, and we're having a look at the importance of setting goals, both in your training and your fundraising, and looking at it from this sort of SMART goals framework. So this is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And we've been chatting to Andrew about how he's integrated this framework into his selection of marathons and half marathons that he's done over the years, and how he's integrated into his fundraising aspirations, as well as how he's picked them from a travel perspective and so on. Towards the end of episode 1, Andrew was discussing the marathons that he'd done and how he'd fundraised, used certain of them for fundraising. So Andrew, welcome back to episode 2. And once you'd done those marathons, what was the sort of next batch of events, and how did you integrate them into your fundraising aspirations?
Since then, I'd say I've done things roughly every 3-4 years, maybe something like that. Typically marathons, because once you're doing 7-8 half marathons a year, people are not going to sponsor you for something that you're doing every other week. So yeah, it more became marathons, with the exception of, and I touched on the fact that after about 80 halves, I had more serious health issues. I had to be more selective with events, in terms of I tend to walk briskly these days rather than run, and therefore I have to be quite selective with events I go to and make sure they have generous cut-off times. I'm not going to get that feeling of being chased by a man in a bus who wants to switch the lights off.
So this comes back to this point about achievable, doesn't it, within these SMART elements of choosing your goals. And I think, depending on where anyone is in their fitness cycle, some races are much harder than others. I mean, I did the Big Sur Marathon last year in California, and that was probably one of the toughest marathons I've ever done. I hadn't researched it properly, but it was absolutely brutal. So if someone doing it for the first time who hadn't trained particularly well wouldn't have enjoyed that race because it was so tough. So when you're choosing these goals, this smart approach to goal setting is so important. But when you choose your half marathons, how far in advance do you do it? So hypothetically, if you were about to do your 90th, would you have already picked your 91st and 92nd? Or did you tend to just make fairly late decisions, bearing in mind that a lot of these races you can get into a couple of weeks before, and you don't necessarily want to be entering that late. Most races, even though the high profile ones obviously have got ballots and it's even hard to get a charity place, most races you can get into fairly late, although it's not recommended, particularly obviously if it's overseas. Because what I'm particularly interested in is what we touched on right at the start, is about the importance of setting your goals in advance so that when you finish a race, you've actually got another one coming up that actually will keep you running. So what were your timeframes on event selection?
I'm going to start in a very politician-orientated way, and in that I'm going to answer a completely different question before coming back to what you've just said. I think you also need to be adaptable. In the first few half marathons, I was always just outside the 2-hour mark. And it became a very big goal that I wanted to get under 2 hours. And finally, it was 2007, and I had entered the Amsterdam half marathon thinking, wow, that's flat, isn't it? I've got all summer to train. Got to be a good one. And then about 3 weeks out from the Amsterdam half, I realized just how well training was going. And I went out and did a final 10-mile prep, and I just flew it. I mean, it was, 2 hours was no longer going to be a barrier. So I went to the coach at the running club and I said, I've noticed there's a half marathon in Peterborough in a week's time. In theory, I'm supposed to be running in 2 weeks. What do you think about entering early? And he said, yeah, absolutely, do it. So in that instance, I entered what is still very much the Great Eastern Run, a fabulous event. I think I've now done 4 of them, and it's not that close to home either. So I entered, I think it was 4 days before, went along and truly smashed my 2 hours. My personal best went to 1:55. I still went to Amsterdam the following weekend, and I again ran under 2 hours I was up about 1:58, 1:59. My legs were somewhat tired, given there wasn't much of a break between. So working the other way, I think if you are ready and can get into another event, if you have something as specific as a time goal, then you need to be prepared to seize that goal and take it. And you'll often hear athletes when they win things, they almost say, I knew I was going to win today because of how my training had gone. You kind of almost know the shape you're in and you're ready to achieve. Now, to answer the actual question you asked, and I think the 100th half is a good example of this, because how soon had I set it in the calendar? Probably about 6 months before. I then had the problem with the 99th because I knew what my 100th was going to be and I had taken a charity place. So I knew there was minimum fundraising. My fundraising pitch was going to be around it's my 100th half marathon. Where was number 99 going to be? Because there had to be a 99. And I had to make darn sure I finished it as well. And in the end, the 99th was only a month before the 100th. I don't know what would have happened had I not finished, because I'd have had to scrabble round very, very quickly. So where there was almost a goal half marathon, then yes, I would enter that much early and kind of the other pieces would fall into place. The problem has very much become since the 100th. And I always knew I was going to have a busy summer. It's busy with work, and also I spent most of July to and from Switzerland for the Women's Euros. So I knew training opportunities were going to be limited this summer. Therefore, getting that 100th in the spring was a good idea rather than an autumn one. But I've kind of gone completely the other way with the Euros, with the work, everything else. Since April the 7th, I think it was the landmarks, first weekend in April. I won't say I've done nothing. I've done a little. Still, when I'm here on Sundays, I will religiously, lace up my trainers. The furthest I've been since April is 5 miles. Not done anything further. There's a lot of 3s in there. I've been to half a dozen park runs. So since I've reached 100 and that kind of incentive as to where do I go next has gone, I've kind of gone completely the other way, which I guess you would be aware, Tim, after a marathon, you can often have put so much effort into getting to the start line that when you finish, it's that big exhale and it's like, right, that's it. And your life
I think, yeah, I
empty.
think it's a real problem for most runners, particularly first time runners. I think when you're in the swing of doing half marathons very regularly, it just becomes a way of life. I think for people who have done a race for the first time, particularly a marathon where the training is 6 to 8 months and everything in your life is geared to that event, it's almost very hard to have a couple of weeks off and then get straight back into it again, particularly if you haven't set a goal. And this is why I always say to people, when we're talking about marathon, particularly London, which, as you said, is more of a social event. It's on the social calendar. You're part of something very significant. It's not like you mentioned Paris. Yeah, that's a great example. Paris, great event, but no profile, particularly in the UK, and it's just another marathon for most people. London isn't. London is a big social event, and I think to be part of something like that that's televised, everyone's heard about it, everyone knows it's happening on the day. The euphoria of completing it disappears fairly quickly, and then you're left with this. If you haven't set a goal, you're left with this void then of where do I go? Because 2 weeks of not training becomes a month, becomes 6 weeks, becomes 2 months. And all of a sudden you've lost a fair bit of fitness, not a huge amount, and then the summer's gone. You touched on it. Summer, so much happens, doesn't it? And all of a sudden we're into September and it's like, well, I've done nothing for 6 months. And then you rewind your fitness and you think, God, I'm probably where I was almost at the start of my marathon prep, which, you won't be that far back, but it's a big deal. So how are you going to get out of that situation? And how would you recommend others who haven't set a goal already get through that?
Yeah, I mean, using London as the example, there'll always be 10 or 15% who it really was a lifetime bucket list tick, and they
Mm.
will go, and that's it. They're never gonna do another marathon. There's then arguably 10 or 15% at the other end of the spectrum who running is their life, and they'll probably already have their next thing lined up. They probably even entered it, and it might be a week or two later. Let's not go into the merits of whether you ought to be running marathons back to back and week to week, because people do daily marathons, and there's some amazing achievements out there by people that just can't comprehend. I guess what we're looking at is the 70 or so percent in the middle for whom it is a big achievement, but what next?
And also people who have set a weight loss goal. You know, my
Yes.
goal is to lose a stone or 2 stone. They do that, and because they haven't necessarily got another goal set, they can then go backwards with the weight loss as
Yeah.
well. So it's not just around events, it's a goal. When you've hit it, what do you then do if you haven't set another goal?
And also, you've of course suddenly got this huge amount of spare time because you're not going out doing 3 and 4 hour long runs on a Sunday morning. And I guess because I always knew I was going to have a busy summer, I haven't fretted too much about there not being anything on the horizon because I knew I was going to have a busy summer. And next week I'm off to the World Athletics in Tokyo. So again, there was no real point entering anything in October because I knew there was going to be 2 weeks right at key training time. What I've done, and I guess I alluded to it in saying, I've still gone out when I could on a Sunday. The swimming pool has again become my friend a couple of times a week. I've just ticked over. So absolutely nothing specific, but equally, it's not been about sitting on the sofa eating donuts all the time. There has been things going on. I'm quite active anyway. I believe the NHS are always telling me how healthy gardening is. Whether they truly mean digging and planting potatoes and stuff, I don't know. But so I'm quite active. I'm doing lots of other stuff anyway. I'm just starting to think what happens after the World Athletics. And I should stress I'm going to spectate at the World Athletics. I'm not part of any team competing. And then I guess I have the difficulty. It'll be October and getting dark and getting cold. So I think for me, the autumn will very much be tick over mileage again, which has been about 15 miles a week, something like that. And then I'm going to be looking to a spring goal, probably another half marathon, where I don't know, maybe back to Reading, because it has been, I think, 3 years since I did Reading. And I do love that event. I truly do. I've seen it grow over the years, and the people of Reading have so adopted it, and the streets are now, relatively speaking, lined. Apart from the last 2 miles on the dual carriageway, that's never lined. But the residential bits of Reading and the town centre, phenomenal. Absolutely love it. And then there's the finish in the football ground as well, which is always nice.
I think for you, having had such a long running streak, if you like, of regular events, it's also about pacing yourself, isn't it? And I think, when we look at these SMART goals or the SMART approach to goal setting, about achievable, time bound, etc. You can't do something all the time
Yep.
because otherwise you'll just totally run out of gas. You'll get bored and you won't ever do it again. So I think your approach there is very sensible because it is about pacing yourself. It's like I'm having a busy summer. I know it's training over the winter is always a challenge, but I need a goal in the spring to make sure I get out and do some training, because if you don't have a spring goal, you're not going to do anything over the winter either, and that's the problem. So I think pacing yourself is absolutely key.
And it's just recognizing where you are in life and whether it's right for you, and not feeling guilty if it's not. And I guess I don't know if it's an appropriate comparison or whatever, but just before the Women's Euros this year, Millie Bright, who would have gone out there as a first choice centre back, said, "Do you know what? My mental health's not in the right place. I'm not going." And she just withdrew from the team, withdrew from the tournament, and was asked, I've seen an interview this week, that they won, what, do you not have any regrets? And she went, "No, none at all." That tournament for me at that time was wrong. And I think therefore in setting your running goals, do you know what? If you need 6 months off because of your own health, your mental health, something's happening in your family, you're moving house, don't feel guilty about it. Take those 6 months off. Come back to something when you want to do it, when you're going to enjoy. Because let's be honest, we all ought to be enjoying this to some way, shape, or form. That's not the 8 miles when it's pouring with rain and it's cold. I think anyone's going to struggle to get too much enjoyment out of that. But if the longer goal on the horizon is the Reading Half, the London Marathon, the London Landmarks, the Great, whatever it is, come back to it refreshed and invigorated and truly relishing what you're doing, and also being proud of what you're doing, whether it's achieving the running, whether that's to achieve a time, whether it's weight loss, as you suggested. Goals can be very, very different. They are very individual. For very few of us is that goal ever winning the race.
What
But
about the travel? Was that a key? Was that a key driver?
that was definitely part of it. Was nice to go and run mainly around Europe. I have done 2 or 3 further afield. The bulk of the overseas have been in Europe. That was always, I guess I looked for races that are a little bit different. You know, when everyone at the running club is doing the identical races again and again and again, you tell them you're heading off to Budapest or Copenhagen or wherever else. I guess it makes you feel a little bit special. If I don't, that's maybe not making me come across as a particularly nice person. You know, hey, look, I'm going to Copenhagen, whereas you're doing the one 3 miles down the road.
No, I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
It was very much for me. It wasn't as one-upmanship to other people. It was very much because that's what I wanted to do. Equally, our club, and I'm sure for those who are members of running clubs, they have what they call their club championships, and there are set races within the club that you do to get points as to whether you're going to be the club champion in the year. And I was never driven by sticking to the set of races they prescribed as being the championship ones. I went and did the races I wanted to do.
That's been really, really useful, Andrew. I think just give us one sentence for someone who's struggling to get back into running after having achieved something great, like running their first half, their first marathon, or having lost a stone, which was their initial goal, and they're struggling to get motivation now. What would you say?
Well, it might be a fairly long sentence with some semicolons. I would say, remember why you did it in the first place and how much joy you got out of it. And that's what you need to re-find. And, you know, it's, if you're not ready to go out and, you know, repeat that half marathon or marathon, do you know what? Go out and do a couple of miles. And if you happen to pick a nice day to do it, you might think, do you know what? That was brilliant. I'll go out and maybe do another couple of miles. And then it's one of those things that does tend to become a little bit habit forming, particularly if you do have a goal on the horizon. I know for some people, knowing that they are making a difference to a cause very close to their heart is what gets them out the door every morning. So it's whatever. Running is the most beautiful individualistic sport there ever can be. No two people are the same, and we've all got different motivations. But if there's one word to summarize it, it's enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely right. Brilliant. Look, that was fantastic. And I hope that you get your next batch of races in the system. And we look forward to hearing what exotic locations you've been jetting off to, and enjoy the World Championship Athletics.
Thanks for listening to this Sapphire Running Zone podcast. Keep checking back as we have lots more podcasts coming soon.